At this time, we're going to go ahead and start our discussions. We're not going to officially call the meeting to order until we have a quorum, which we expect to have soon. Once we have a quorum and start the meeting, I'll give a little background, but we're going to kind of jump down the agenda to two topics and two presentations that are kind of a follow-up and reiteration of some of the information we had before. So I'm going to start with Edward, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics that we had previously discussed, and then we'll have a discussion with Adam, and then we'll take a break until we have a quorum present. So thanks everyone for being here, and Edward.
Thank you, Chair Coe. Per the Chair's direction, she wanted me to circle back on a topic that we had touched in brief with Professor Takagi at the Moritz College of Law related to districting, and he kind of pointed out some of the legal perils thereof, but the Chair wanted to ensure that the committee, at least through this pre-meeting informational session, could at least have kind of, I guess, districting 101 and provide that as a basis for discussion and deliberation amongst the committee members. So I would actually draw your attention either to the handouts in front of you or to the screens to your left. First and foremost, I guess we always like to start with whatever existing law tends to be on the matter. And so I would be remiss if I pointed out that there is no current charter law on this matter. We haven't had anything in the charter for 103 years as related to this topic at all. And so any discussion of that topic necessarily would follow how we put lines on this map, which represents the corporate boundaries of the city. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of these are best practices. This is not original research from staff. This was kind of compiled after looking at information from fairvote.org, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, the Congressional Research Service, Ballotpedia, and Loyola Law School in Los Angeles to see what are the best practices when it does come to districting around the country, and what are some things that we should look to as we examine this system and deliberate on it. First thing is decennial review. I don't necessarily want to say it's a best practice, but it is an accepted practice that in the event that you are going to district, you do so after the federal census so that you have the most accurate information about where people are based on census tracts and information of that sort, so that your map doesn't get too far out of date. And as people shift around, as you know, Columbus is a growing city that has not shrunk in size from census to census, and so having that information available is crucial towards making representative districts if the committee or if council chose to go down such a route. Other commonly accepted criteria we've kind of divided into two buckets, population considerations and geographic considerations. Regarding population, districts ought to be equal in population size. There is a legal requirement that you look towards protection of racial and language minorities against vote dilution, and so that kind of speaks to some of the cracking or packing language that Professor Takagi used. And typically you should not be drawing maps to overtly favor one political party. Those being the population considerations. Geographically, what we look towards as best practices are compactness, contiguity. So there are instances where you see maps where a district is not all attached. A best practice is, yes, the district should be compact, it should be contiguous, it should be all together. You shouldn't cross a street and then realize you're not in the district, and then cross that subsequent street and then realize you're back in that district. And then maintenance of communities of interest are also very important. I mention this term, and it's in quotes, communities of interest, because it's not the easiest thing to define as you go through this process, and oftentimes the body, the authority that ends up drawing the maps has to look at it and say, yes, we do feel this is a community of interest to preserve, it's important, they're compact, and so that can be somewhat of a nebulous term through this process, but one that is important nonetheless. The next question, after you determine if this is what you want to do, is who in fact would draw the map. We see two predominant forms of doing this. One is legislative districting. amongst cities and states, this tends to be the most popular form of districting, and this is to say the legislative authority itself is the districting and redistricting authority as well. They create the maps, they implement the maps. They're usually subject to some form of criteria in city code or city charter, and oftentimes in this process, that process is subject to executive veto, not in every instance, but in an overwhelming majority of instances. The other popular form of who draws the map is a citizens commission. And this is a group of individuals who are appointed to draw one or more plans to submit to the legislative authority, who in some cases have to look at the map and say yes or no without amendment, who in some cases can offer slight amendments, or they have multiple plans and they have to choose from among the multiple submissions given to them. And similarly, the Citizens Commission has to follow criteria established either in code or in charter. So as we kind of zoom through this, and I am more than free to answer questions if I'm moving a bit too quickly, but the best practices, we found that those fell into 4 buckets. One, public input. One best practice seemed to be making the data used to draw the lines publicly available. The holding of public hearings prior to the unveiling of any maps, and providing mechanisms to solicit and respond to public feedback after maps are produced. In terms of the transparency best practices, we saw that requiring public meetings in the process was important, and one question that would have to be answered eventually is, should the districting authority have to offer any explanation of the plan submitted? Sometimes they can just submit a plan and say, here it is, and this is the plan we're going with, and sometimes they kind of have to offer this explanation to say, we felt that this was the best plan because. Continuing on composition of the districting authority, one question that seems to be continuously asked is, if you go with a citizens commission, are the individuals who draw the lines permitted to run for office after drawing the lines? And how do we feel about the individuals appointed reflecting sufficient diversity, and how do we define that as a city? And then lastly, the best practice is kind of results-based. Is the map that's produced, did it crack or pack minority groups or language minority groups? If communities of interest are drawn apart, is there a sensible reason to do so? It's not that in and of itself is bad, but is there a legitimate reason why you said we had to put a line on the map, and this is why we did it, because it had to go somewhere. And then lastly, as a results-based, the map cannot overtly favor one political party in one particular district or another just for that sake. I put questions here, but I also want to allow Adam Friedman to kind of enter the conversation to discuss and refresh our memory as to some of the Voting Rights Act information Professor Takagi presented, just to offer a refresher in this session.
Chair Coe, committee members, thank you. What you have before you is an overview of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, broken down into a couple different subsections here. We won't go into each subsection's detail, but I'd like to at least walk you through some of the aspects of Section 2. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits states and their political subdivisions from utilizing voting practices or procedures which result in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. A violation of Section 2 occurs when, based on the totality of the circumstances, the challenged electoral process is not equally open to participation by members of a racial minority group, in that its members have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. The essence of a Section 2 claim is that a certain electoral law, practice, or structure interacts with social and historical conditions to cause an inequality in the opportunities enjoyed by minority and majority voters to elect their preferred representatives. Section 2 does not confer a right to proportional representation, but rather a right to participate equally in the political process. Claims brought under Section 2 are commonly referred to as vote dilution claims. Gingles is the seminal case applying Section 2, and there are three elements to establish a prima facie case that you can see there. Once a person satisfies this prima facie case, he must then, under the totality of the circumstances, prove that minority voters have less opportunity than members of the majority group to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. To that end, the Gingles case identifies 7 factors relevant to this consideration, and those 7 include the history of voting-related discrimination in the jurisdiction, the extent to which voting in the elections of the jurisdiction is racially polarized, the extent to which the jurisdiction has used voting practices or procedures that tend to enhance the opportunity for discrimination against the minority group, such as unusually large election districts, majority vote requirements, and prohibitions against bullet voting. Number 4, the exclusion of members of the minority group from candidate slating processes, the extent to which minority group members bear the effect of past discrimination in areas such as education, employment, and health, which hinder their ability to participate effectively in the political process, the use of overt or subtle racial appeals in political campaigns, and 7, the extent to which members of the minority group have been elected to public office in the jurisdiction. These factors are neither comprehensive nor exclusive, and other relevant factors may always be considered. Further, there's no requirement that any particular numbers of factors be proved or that a majority of them point one way or the other. The ultimate issue here in Section 2 claims is whether, again, under the totality of the circumstances, the challenged electoral process is equally open to minority voters. This inquiry requires both a searching practical evaluation of the past and present reality and an intensely local appraisal of the design and impact of the contested mechanisms. Once again, a discriminatory result is all that is required. Intent to discriminate is not relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions related to either one of those presentations?
I have a question.
Please.
In a comment, probably. I should know the answer to this, but I honestly don't know. Is there a Section 2 complaint been filed? Hasn't Mr. Beard said upon a couple of occasions when he's come before us that there's been a Section 2 complaint filed? And what, if so, what's the status of that?
Chair Coe, Committee Member Mills, at this time, there is no outstanding Section 2 Voting Rights Act claim against the City of Columbus. And just as a refresher from our previous discussion, where Professor Takagi said that the relevant question is how much money has the city spent defending its current electoral system in court, the answer to that question is $0.
Let's talk about that just a bit more. All right. Of course, it's districting that raises the question. We don't have districting, so it follows that there might have been any litigation about it. I get that. Now, we've had some talk about, gosh, wouldn't it be neat, maybe interesting, better choice of words, if members of council would if members of council would assume a special relationship with a given geography. Not legally a district, you understand. The council would choose these, if you will, but there'd be everybody serve at large, everybody be elected at large, and so the districting process wouldn't have any implications with respect to the power of vote. I'm just curious about whether or not even going down that path suddenly raises the specter of this sort of claim. Does that question make any sense?
I'll restate it because I think I understand
Thank
what he's
you.
asking. I think the idea being if there was some geographic assignment of council members, but yet every citizen of Columbus cast a vote for every member of council, what litigation-related challenges would that pose in comparison to where we currently have everything at large or the alternative of everything within a district where you only vote within your district? So that seems to be a middle point idea. What's the legalities around that?
It's perfect.
So that's a very good question. and I think it goes to the heart of any city that that considers shifting from an at-large structure to any district representation, whether it's all districts, hybrid, or some other form. And I will say of the folks here, I'm not an attorney. These guys are. So I am not practicing law without a license. I'm only saying what I've been provided when I worked with the Secretary of State's office. First of all, as to assigning council members to geographic areas, the Voting Rights Act applies to a election system. So we're not talking about election system there. So that would be the first question, I think. When you get to the issue of any of the other requirements of the Voting Rights Act, they would absolutely apply to the city of Columbus. And it is absolutely possible that someone could draw lines that could violate the Voting Rights Act. So I think that's why Edward's presentation is so important. Getting those best practices right up front make it less likely that you will have that outcome on the back end, if that makes sense. I don't think that whether you are talking about people being elected from a district or some hybrid where they have geographic representation but everyone votes on them changes the fact that you still have to have roughly equal population. You would still have requirements as to compactness, contiguousness with no intersecting lines. You would still, if it is in the charter, have to consider things like favoring one political party or another, and then you would absolutely have issues surrounding packing or cracking of minorities or of communities of language of interest.
A lot of sense to me, and then it went off the rails. Let's assume for the moment that City Council simply convened and said, rather than everybody trying to master this whole city, let's sort of split it up and take a responsibility just to be smart about a particular geography. We're not going to change how we elect people. We're not going to change how council votes. It's just sorting out who's going to step up and be first line to help, to pay attention to the needs of a particular geography. I'm really perplexed, and maybe I misunderstood the answer, that would implicate. It would not. Thank you. So we're on the same page. Thank you. Thank you.
Other question? I'm trying to put thoughts together in my head. Sorry. Other questions?
Brian, I was listening to you, but you lost me at one point where you said someone could possibly draw a line. Were you talking about within a redistricting proposal and not what we, okay, that's where I.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So within any given redistricting proposal, as we all know, and everyone's been around, good ones and not so good ones, you can draw districts that can be challenged. It is not, I would be remiss if I didn't know that the city of Chicago ran into that issue. That city council, 50 members, if I remember correctly, is majority African American. That caucus controlled the redistricting process and packed and cracked Latino voters. They then faced federal litigation over that loss, over those lines. It's happened twice now. If I remember correctly, Edward, over the past 20 years, it's been 8 million. 20 million, yeah. 8 million in one, 20 over the course of 20 years. So a significant amount of money. It's also worth noting that Chicago is, in so many ways, a bizarre animal. They don't have complete control over their process. They do not have best practices built into their process for redistricting. So you have all those sort of quirks there.
You presented information about different best practice options where, like, the legislative body itself would do the process of drawing lines in districts or those kinds of things, or a citizen kind of panel. Do one or the other of those have less litigation, or one or the other of those seen more favorably for some reason, ultimately?
I can't give a precise answer to the question. I would say because historically legislative districting has prevailed, it's where we kind of defaulted when we started the notion of drawing lines, and because it is the most popular, I would say it probably has faced more litigation than a citizen commission just because of longevity and popularity, so there are just more opportunities to litigate those maps.
How do the citizens typically get on that committee?
They're usually appointed by a legislative and possibly executive authority, or there tends to be some mechanism for appointing citizens outside of that, but those are usually the two methods to get to putting folks on a citizens commission around this issue.
Other questions, Fred?
Not a question, but a comment. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't let you know that on best practices, in the newly structured way we're going to draw state house districts, and the proposals that we're still working on for congressional districts, there's specifically a criteria that partisan representation is a criteria in the Constitution of Ohio now, and could be for congressional districts as well. You didn't talk about that in your list. I think it should be noted that that's something that at the state level has been acknowledged as an important criteria.
Chair Coe, part of the reason we didn't present that as one of the best practices criteria is because in our charter, we have nonpartisan elections, and so operating under that paradigm, we would essentially be unable, or it'd be unwise, one would say, to acknowledge the partisan criteria in that factor because we don't list that on the ballot. And so what we did observe essentially through looking through the best practices, they said you really shouldn't draw the lines with respect to a political partisan outcome.
Can someone flesh out for me what these two things mean, because it's not connecting?
Well, I'll certainly, I understand your answer. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I certainly understand what you're saying about nonpartisan elections, and to acknowledge in our documents that you're going to take into account partisan numbers. There's been a great deal of talk, and I don't mean to bore you about this legislative stuff that I've been working on, but there's a great deal of talk, and I think general agreement among both parties, between both parties, that a system that creates, let's say in the state house where 2/3 of all the members are Republican, in a state that's essentially 50-50, there's something wrong. Or in a congressional map, when you have 16 districts and 12 of them are Republican in a 50-50 state, that needs to be taken into account when you draw the new districts. So a criteria was put in for the state house districts to take that into account. It's not the only factor. Compactness, contiguous, all those things also apply, but one of the criteria is that it will create representative fairness, and that's what I've been talking about, the 7-0 representative fairness. It's a city level.
Sorry, did I? Just
No,
wanna make sure
that's
I'm
okay,
understanding. So
yeah.
the idea would be that, I think you just said like 12 out of 16 were typically Republican
Currently.
districts. So you're talking about trying to make a process that would take into account making that more reflective of the fact that the state's more 50-50?
Correct.
Okay, I got you. And you're saying it wasn't included because the charter still talks about elections in a nonpartisan sense?
Yes, ma'am. And so, and please, Committee Member Mills, correct me if I'm wrong, but with some of the redistricting, there are seats that are appointed or individuals that are represented based on appointed by the leader of the minority party of each legislative chamber. We don't do that because we don't have a minority and majority leader in this legislative body, so there's no official mechanism that represents that.
Right to the committee? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
To the committee that would be drawing lines? To the
Yes,
Citizens
yes,
Committee?
Yes. If that, please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr.
No,
Are
that's
we
right,
talking about
but-
two different things, though? Like, I'm just trying to make sure.
No, I
Okay.
just think that's kind of a red herring. If you go to a district system or a hybrid system, which I would be in favor of, and you would allow or permit certain members to draw districts, you would include members of both parties in it. I understand you don't have a minority leader because there are no minority members. So, but I think you could create a system where you could have representation of both major political parties in drawing in new
I
districts.
think I follow you in the sense that, let me see if I'm saying this correctly here, but the way our charter's written, regardless of who was elected to the current 7 members of council, we don't distinguish that as being one party or the other within that structure. So,
I acknowledge that that's a valid.
so even if it was 4-3 in one direction or another, you still don't have this distinguishing factor of one party versus the other. But what you're saying is if you had a citizen panel, you could still ensure that there were members from each party represented on that panel.
Absolutely.
I think that's what we're saying, or what you're saying right now, so I can comprehend this. Okay, Jeanette.
Question, were we talking about two things? Were you talking about representation on the panel, but then I thought you said the panel could use parties as part of the criteria to establish districts?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we were talking,
things.
there were two separate
Exactly.
things that got, okay,
Yes.
now I understand what you're saying.
That was where my head was going to.
That
Brian.
could actually have to take that into consideration.
Yes,
It's not just that they are empowered to consider it, it's
It's
one of their
part of the-
criteria.
Criteria they have to consider.
so there's so the actual panel itself, the composition of the panel is diverse within party.
Yes.
And then you're saying that the charge, they can take the criteria of partisanship in drawing the districts.
Not just can, they must.
They must. That's a big distinction.
Yeah. Amongst other factors, though.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
It's not the
Similar
top
factors.
criteria, but it's.
It's one of them. Got it. Brian, did you want to add something?
Chair Coe, members of the committee, I think that Committee Member Mills raises a very valid point, and you can further break down this representational fairness into two questions. The first is how likely is a member of a minority party to win in the district or to prevail in the district. So that's one measure, because it would be unfair to have, a 70-30 Democratic district, but then all Republican districts are, 51-49, right? So, and the second is how fair in totality is the distribution of districts. So how likely is it that the electoral outcome would mirror the electoral reality of that city or state? Now, having said that, I would respectfully point out two things I think are very important to remember as we delve from the state level or the federal level down to the city level. And I think this is where a state like California is a place we may want to look for some things to consider. Unlike the state of Ohio, which is 53-47 Republican probably. The city of Columbus is typically 70-30 Democratic. So, how do you define bipartisan in an environment that is not bipartisan in the way that we think of at the state level? So I think that is a challenge, first of all. The second is what data do you use to define partisanship when all local elections are nonpartisan? And I think that's why you see that most cities have not incorporated these as best practices. And in Edward's research, we're really looking at municipal best practices versus state or federal best practices. And I think it's an important distinction there. Would it be fair to say that a presidential or a gubernatorial election is the data that we use to draw districts for municipal boundaries? It may be, it may not be, but we are inherently leaving out in that calculus the votes that actually happen for council members. So, again, I think there is a way to get at your point, which I think Edward was alluding to, that rather than saying you have representational fairness per se, where if you have, let's say, 15 districts, then you're guaranteed that 3 would be Republican and the remainder Democratic, which would probably mirror the voting trend of our city. You say that you cannot overtly favor either political party in the drawing of the districts, sort of removing that from the hands of the districting folks. Just wanted to share that as some observations from other cities.
So, thinking about the objectives of this committee and an idea of proposing something that would have some type of district representation of some kind in it, and getting to the point of here's what the map looks like, here's what the language. I guess I need some guidance a little bit here on what this committee could and should do in comparison to sort of to the next levels. I mean, I think we talked a lot in the last few meetings about, we want to be clear, we want to have specific recommendations, but I also think, we have to defer to the elected body that's held responsible for these things. So can you give me some thoughts on where you would typically see, even in other communities that maybe have made these changes, kind of where those steps came from, if that question's making any sense?
I will speak only for the administration and would defer to my colleague Edward to speak for council on this and use the word defer in bold because council will have to make these decisions ultimately. I think that once you enter into this realm of districting and how you make these decisions, ideally, the public would have a lot of opportunity to weigh in on that. And I think at the end of the day, if you're asking our elected representatives to make an informed decision, giving them some broad direction with some preference for public input, and then really, it's on their shoulders to carry that forward and to hear from the community, hear about what is important to them. Where would they weight these things? Would they say representational fairness is important? I'm more concerned about communities of interest. Would they say, well, overall, the most important thing to me is representational fairness. I think that's best teased out in a very public process with our elected representatives at council.
Does that mean that a committee like this would make a general recommendation, and then council also would first solicit public input before they made some type of recommendation or decided to put something on a ballot? Or would there be a ballot process and then the public kind of speaks through that process? Does that make sense?
It would certainly have to be in the charter, whatever the criteria are. I cannot think of, I'm not saying that there are no top 50 cities, but in looking at this, I don't recall top 50 cities that lack direction in their charters versus leaving it to the legislative body to set these and frankly change them over time without citizen input. I think this is just such a important and vital issue to get right that it would be in all of our best interest to hear from as many people as possible, engage folks. So by way of background, I had the opportunity as Director of Policy and Research at the Secretary of State's office to run a redistricting competition, to work with Dick Gunther, to work with the League of Women Voters, to really hear all the things that you're talking about, all your friends and people who, you agree to disagree, but they bring such amazing wealth of knowledge and experience. They challenge you to think differently. They give you an opportunity to vet things in a way that that I think really informs that final council decision in a way that a committee report can't, which is why I would, you're asking for our direction, our advice. My advice would be general direction. It should be, here are the criteria we think you should consider, but listen to the people of Columbus if you go down this direction.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I concur.
Okay.
Well done.
Wow, that was great. Okay, question?
This conversation, it seems like we're moving more toward a formalized district recommendation. When we were talking before, we were talking about, to me, dividing the city up into almost like service areas. When we were talking about using, or when we were given the battalion map. The battalion map with 7 areas, so this has taken a different, more formal approach when we're talking about actually drawing lines. I'm just saying that it seems like we've moved beyond recommending to council that they divvy up the city among the council members with a service perspective to something a little more formal than a districting plan.
I guess I want to address that a little bit. I think because of the quorum issue, we're kind of a little out of order. I think that is the discussion that I want to at least have,
Okay.
is a little more formal.
Okay, I'm just saying
And I'm
that we
gonna
went from.
Yes, I think we did.
We had been talking about just like a
Yes.
service areas.
Yes.
And now this is a more formal districting proposal.
I
Okay.
think the information I asked them to
All right.
share was, are there ways of making this a little more formal without going completely down the path of a district only elected by those district members? Because I think Professor Takaji at one point, and at least in some of the original material, there had been mention, is it a by-place election? Like, is that a concept, by place? Is that the right thing? That I remember hearing about, but we didn't really flesh out as much. And so this was just, that was kind of the purpose, and that's what I was going to explain, that I just feel like it seemed like many of us were comfortable with the recommendations we were making so far, but it just seemed like there was something more that needed to be addressed. And I still come back, I keep thinking about geography and representation and the representational fairness. But just how do we, it seems like there needed to be something else. And so that was what I wanted, and I think that's a little bit what Brian's going to address when we have a quorum and can have an official meeting called to order. But I think that was the idea, was let's explore this a little bit more and see what else might be out there. Fred, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to make a comment. I've been the vocal proponent of going to, if you're going to add members, you need to go to districts in some way or another. But I totally agree with what Brian just said, and that this is would be a big step, and that you would need citizen input to create these criteria. I don't think we're capable of doing that in the time we have left as a committee, but or maybe in my life, I don't know. But
Come back and keep working on this.
but I totally agree with what you laid out as the process, even though it sounded like maybe I wanted to do it tomorrow. I know it's a process issue.
It seems like a multi-step process, not seems like it is, such a multi-step process that was what I was trying to flesh out, that I think we could ultimately have some recommendations, but there's a lot of this that's so unknown that you would need much greater input. John, anything you want to add at this point?
Thank you.
Any other questions, concerns? Okay, well, it's about 2:27, so we're going to take a break until Carrie or Pastor Laws arrives, and we'll resume at that point. Well, we'll actually start our meeting at that time. Thanks, everybody. We do have a quorum, so we're going to continue with presentations now. And I just want to kind of go back. We covered a little bit of this before we actually started the meeting, but I had asked staff to present some additional information and clarify some of the information that had already been presented, specifically relative to districts or geographical assignments of council members, some of those discussions. I just felt like, although I think we made great progress at the last few meetings, I felt like many of us just seemed to feel like there was something still that needed to be discussed or fleshed out or potentially do more is the best way I can describe that. So my plan at this point is that we are going to have this discussion today, and then we will probably, my expectation is not take any votes today, but hopefully be able to give staff and others some idea of where we want to go. Maybe take a vote on giving staff some idea of where we want to go. And then we will have at least one more meeting after this. As I indicated in an email, I will be out of town starting Tuesday. So it'll be sometime in February after the 7th. And for that reason, I think, Mr. Mills, you wanted to address an issue so we can talk about the bylaws? Or did you want me to address the issue?
You may.
Okay.
You can use me
Well-
as the excuse, though.
We are all an excuse. I think many of us were anticipating this committee's recommendations happening before the end of the month. So because there's a number of potential conflicts in February, I'd like to propose that we change the bylaws slightly to allow for a member to participate via conference call or some kind of webinar, Skype, something electronic, if they were going to be out of town, so we could proceed. So specifically, I would like to move to amend the bylaws, Chapter 1, Section 3, to say, for the purposes of determining a quorum and in order to vote, a committee member must be physically present at the meeting to be considered present. Unless physical presence is not possible, then a committee member shall be considered present through electronic means. Is there a second to that motion? Second. All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, so we will amend the bylaws to reflect that. Your hand those, Andrea. Thank you. Yeah.
What is it that you said?
Maybe we'll just go with the phone conference so we don't have to see what he's enjoying.
Just a conference, no visuals.
Exactly. The minute.
Maybe 20 inches of snow out here.
We did have minutes sent out, so I'd like to move on to the approval of those minutes. Were there any comments or concerns about the minutes that were emailed? Could I have a motion to approve those minutes? All those in favor? Thank you. Anyone opposed? All right. Yes, please.
I know before we thank staff for all the hard work, but I think we should acknowledge the work of our city clerk. Every time I read the minutes, for a job well done.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, we do.
Okay. I would absolutely second that. It's fantastic. Thank you. We will move on to whether there was a summary of any public comments received. Stephanie?
We did receive 3 public comments since the January 11th meeting. They're in the hard copies are in the manila folder with the summary, and then additionally they'll be posted on the website in a digital format to easily be able to go through all of them.
I don't believe there are any speakers for today that we have seen yet. Okay, thank you. Okay, so our agenda reflected 2 presentations, and prior to having a quorum and officially starting the meeting, Edward reviewed some of the information that Professor Takaji had shared and some of the information we'd already looked at. But I believe Brian has some of the new information that I asked staff to put together. So Brian, we'll turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chair Coe and members of the committee. I'll have the presentation up there, and I think you have copies of it in front of you as well. So specifically, Chair Coe tasked myself and Edward with 2 things. The first was a revisit of council structure globally, and then at the request of Committee Member Rosenberger, some specific information about a hybrid district form that we have previously discussed. So I'll go through this presentation. It's I don't want to say that it's disjointed, but we have built on it. So it has floors it didn't originally have. So hopefully it'll still make sense, right? So I want to start with what is currently in our Columbus City Charter. The legislative power of the city, except as reserved to the people by this charter, shall be vested in a council consisting of 7 members elected at large. That's it. So that sort of encompasses what we expect of our city council in our current charter. I'm going to give an overview of very broad types of council structure, and I want to begin, and I will reemphasize throughout this, there is a great deal of variation within these. There are some cities that use primaries, others use runoff. Some require a 50% winning margin, others use plurality. So even within these things I'm going to discuss, there's still a great deal of variation. We'll start with what we have here in Columbus, an at-large city council. Typically, council members are elected by the entire city, which serves as a multi-member district, if you will. Members are elected either in a field race where you essentially have the option to vote for up to the number of seats to be filled in both the primary and the general, and the top vote getters are elected. The other is a by-place election where the entire city votes on that particular individual, but they have a seat that they filed for. At-large and field and by-place elections are among the most competitive and contested in the country. Ward councils. So again, pretty straightforward. Committee members are elected from geographic wards or districts. Members are elected by place, which means these are head-to-head elections. These are among some of the least competitive elections in the country.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
Just because I got a call on it last night from a citizen, and there was some committee testimony submitted. Can you, just back to this last slide about the competitiveness of our current races. There was some testimony submitted that provided another view on that was different. Can you address the difference?
Yes,
in the-
Chair Coe and members of the committee, if it's okay, I do have several slides that cover that issue later on, so if you're okay with covering that later, we can certainly do that. And I'll go a little beyond what I prepared here in the presentation to sort of answer some of those questions that have been raised. And I want to highlight, when I talk about the ward councils, I'm talking about cities that only have wards in this slide, not cities that have any sort of hybrid system. Now we get to hybrid councils. So there is a great deal of variation here, but I do want to highlight the three most common forms. The first has multiple members elected at large in a field race, and then the rest of council is elected from wards. The second has one or more members elected at large by place. The rest of the council is elected from wards. And then lastly, you have a system where members are elected at large by place, but they qualify for the ballot based on districts. So we'll talk about hybrid at-large field, and I'm going to sort of delve into each of these different types of council. Here, the council consists of some members elected by the entire city, where they act essentially as a multi-member district in the city, the same way we elect folks here in Columbus. The rest are elected from geographic wards where only the voters in that ward run against each other. Like we talked about with the field races, the at-large member runs against other people in the field. They can live anywhere in the city, voted on by everyone. Ward members file for a specific seat. Those elections are always head-to-head, where they only run against other candidates in that particular ward. I'm provided in the next slide, and it's a little hard to see up there, but this is using Ohio's requirements for a printed ballot and what a voter would see in that type of system if it existed here in the city of Columbus. First, you see a box that has 4 names and 4 bubbles, and the instruction to the voter is to vote for not more than 2. So the voter can choose any of those 2 people, and then the 2 individuals with the most total votes would win in that election. There's no requirement that they exceed 50% in that system. And then they would also, in that same ballot, have a council district. In this case, we've called it District 5, and there the instruction to the voters to vote for not more than 1. Next, we have the hybrid at-large by place. Here, council consists of some members that are elected by the entire city, some elected from wards. The at-large members file for a specific seat. It's usually referred to as council seat 1, 2, 3, whatever. And they run against other candidates who have filed for the same seat, but they can live anywhere in the city, and they're voted on by every eligible elector. Just like the previous ward systems, the ward members would file for that geographic seat, have to live in it, run against other people who live in that ward. To help understand that, I also have what that ballot might look like. Here you have an example where they are voting for 2 at-large seats that are up for election, and the instruction to the voter would be to vote for not more than 1 for at-large seat 1 and at-large seat 2, and then for their district representative, vote for not more than 1 for the district. Now we get to what we've been asked to present a little bit more information about, and I'm going to skip a little bit in this presentation, so hope that it still makes sense once we get through it. We're calling this a hybrid district. So there are various terms that are used for this. There is not a generally accepted term in academic literature for this. The best way to think of it would be district at large, I think would be what I would call it. Here, council consists of members who qualify for election by district, but are elected by the entire city in the primary and the general. So essentially, members would file for a specific geographic district. These are not citywide seats, these are districts based on where they live, and they would only run against other candidates who live in that district. Members are still voted on, though, by every eligible voter in the city. The next slide will show that there are variations of this particular hybrid district system used in Tucson, Arizona, Reno, Nevada, Sparks, Nevada, and then in Washington State, it's used in 32 of 39 county commissions, as well as various cities and school districts that are in that state. Now, I will say that there are other areas in the country that use this, but with a limited time allowed, these are the ones that we were able to verify for the committee's consideration. And I do want to highlight again that there is variation between these. For example, Tucson has partisan elections, Reno, Nevada has nonpartisan elections. So it is important to point that out. Here's what a voter would see if we had a system like this in the city of Columbus. You would see that here we have districts 5, 6, and 7 appearing on the ballot, and the instruction to the voter would be to vote for not more than 1 in District 5, not more than 1 in District 6, and not more than 1 in District 7. So from the voter's perspective, it's really no different than what they would already see on a ballot. So now I'd like to get to the question that Committee Member McCarthy asked, and that's competitiveness of elections. This is previous data that we presented. I have added one additional piece of data based on some of the conversation from the committee, and that is incumbency and how likely a particular system is to lead to a challenger beating an incumbent in a given election. So here's our methodology. We used original data for elections that covered all members of council in the top 25 cities in the country. We received that data either from a city election official, a state election official, or Ballotpedia, which is actually a pretty great sort of repository for this type of information. For contestedness, we have divided the number of seats up for election by the number of seats with more than one candidate. So that tells us that a person's not running essentially unopposed. Is that seat contested? For margin of victory, the way that this would always be calculated in any, whether it's for a campaign purpose or a political science purpose, is to subtract the lowest winning vote percentage from the highest losing vote percentage. This would apply whether it's a head-to-head race or a field race. The committee has received testimony that this is not an appropriate way to calculate a margin of victory. And I'll sort of walk through how that individual arrived at his numbers and why that would lead to some counterintuitive results for the committee. It's been argued that the way that you should calculate it is the same way that you would calculate percent change between two given numbers, where you subtract the new number from the old number, divide it by the old number, and that gives you the percent change. How would that work in a practical situation? If someone won a race 72-25, I think we would intuitively say they won by 50%. If you use that calculation, they won by 100%. So that's why you don't use that process to calculate the margin of victory for any given election system. And then we get to incumbency. So there we divide the number of incumbents who lost by the number of incumbents who ran in that given election. First, we have rank ordered these types of systems by the most contested elections. There we see that systems that have a hybrid system of at-large field and at-large by place, in those systems, the at-large elections are the most likely to be contested. I would note that for the at-large by place, the only reason that isn't 100% is that the mayor of Fort Worth, who lives in a council manager city, ran unopposed. So that was sort of an outlier in our data and is the only reason why it wasn't the most competitive. We also see in descending order that a pure ward system is more competitive than hybrid systems that have both wards and at-large elections. Next, we move to the lowest margin of victory. Here, low is good. For at-large field races, 7.26%. This does jump quite a bit to the at-large by place, but the way that I would sort of couch this is there is still a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison there, because you've got folks who are able to either bullet vote, so they choose to vote for 1 of 4 instead of 4 of 4, or you may have folks that do not have a full slate running, meaning that you may have 4 seats up, but only 7 people appear on the ballot. So these are things that could sort of skew that a little bit, but it still gives you the flavor of how many votes a person would need to get to have won that race. Again, we see that at-large systems do provide the lowest margin of victory, although ward elections in a hybrid by-place system is not too far behind the at-large elections that are by place. And then lastly, we get to some new data for the committee. This is how many incumbents lost, okay? What we found was that if you are running at-large in a hybrid system with by-place elections, over 11% of the incumbents that ran lost that election. That drops down to 4.6% for the ward elections in the same cities. I think that's a pretty meaningful analysis there, because we're looking at the same elections in the same cities with the same political dynamics, and see that if you're running by place at large, you are more likely to face a winning challenger than you would be if you're running in a ward race in that same city. This right here is just a difficult to see chart that captures all of that data in a single snapshot to give you a sort of a sense of across all of the different spectrums what council structures tend to give you the most competitive elections. By far, at-large elections, whether they are in a hybrid system or in a system like Columbus, will tend to give you better competitiveness on the 3-point scale that we're using here. The contestedness, the margin, and the incumbents that lose. So now we move back to our hybrid district discussion. Staff was asked to put together how a system like that might work in the city of Columbus. So first I want to look at some current best practices, going back through all the data that's been presented to this committee from the very beginning. And these are practices that Columbus currently employs for its council structure and elections. First, nonpartisan elections. The second is staggered terms. The third is an elimination primary followed by a general election that is preferred over a runoff system. And then lastly, every voter has a voice for every elected official in the city, and that flows from the competitiveness analysis that we just walked through. So what would a Columbus plan potentially look like if we move to this sort of hybrid districts approach? First, it would likely require the expansion of council to 9 members. That would bring council into line with its peer cities across the country in terms of size. Second, it would require the establishment of 9 districts using proven best practices, which we discussed in our informational session. It would require members to qualify for a nonpartisan election based on the district in which they live. It would require candidates to run against other candidates from that district in both the primary and the general election. It would require staggered terms for council members, and it would allow every eligible Columbus elector to vote for every member of council. We were asked to provide, in our opinion, what some of the potential benefits of this system could be. First, in our opinion, this would establish geographic representation and accountability without creating the parochial interests, log rolling, vote trading, horse trading that tends to prevail in cities with ward systems. Secondly, it would allow council members to maintain a citywide vision while requiring them to have a focus on their specific neighborhood or district. It would maintain voters' rights to choose their elected officials, a right that voters have had in the city of Columbus for over 102 years. It would utilize the most politically competitive council structures, and it would bring council size into the norm for peer cities. And then for my final slide, this is section 2 of our current charter. There was a question asked about how a transition would work. This is very typical of charters that were passed at the turn of the previous century, where they establish the term of office, except that in the first election after the charter is passed, the candidates that receive the highest number of votes, in our charter it was the 4 candidates, would serve for 4 years, and the remainder of the candidates would serve a 2-year term and then run for a full 4-year term. Hypothetically, in Columbus, you could expand the size of council in 2019, and then in 2021 establish districts. The districts where candidates received the 5 highest margins of victory would serve for 4 years. The districts that received the 4 lowest would serve for 2 and then would be up again. That is one very common way that you would get at that staggered term issue, which is always a little bit of a challenge in terms of that transition. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions the committee has. I will point out, thanks to my friends at council, this is in color. So this is a matrix of everything we just discussed and kind of goes through. And if you have a question about, well, you know, who decides in a primary under a hybrid at-large system, this would sort of guide you to that answer.
Thank you. Questions or comments to start? Jen?
Brian, would you go over, I'm not clear on the hybrid by place, I think it is. Hybrid at large by place. Does that, I'm thinking terminology. Are the at large, would that be like 9 council members, 3 would be at large? Is that what you're,
Yes,
it would be a
so-
split?
Absolutely. So the hybrid is that you would have, let's say, 5 council members that serve from districts. You would have 4 that would serve from the entire city, but rather than running against each other in a field race, they would run head-to-head for a seat, if you will. For the district and for the at-large.
See, and that's where you're losing me, when the
So the at-large, think of it as the entire city is a district. And each person is running for that district head-to-head. So rather than having, if you look at, if you could go to the next slide. So here you have seat 1 at-large, so everyone in the city would get to vote for one of those 2 candidates.
Okay, that's where I was.
Yeah, seat 2
Yeah,
at large, everyone at the city, in the city votes for one of those 2, and then only the people in District 5 would see District 5 on their ballot.
And the people that were on the ballot for at-large seat 1 or 2 have identified that they want to run for that seat.
That is correct. You
But
have
they
to
could live
file.
anywhere.
It's like running for judge or county commissioner. You have to list the expiration of the term, and that determines who you run against.
Okay.
But that's not the Columbus hypothetical you put together.
That is correct.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, I want to think about it a lot more, but I like that hypothetical.
The Columbus hypothetical. And I think, so the big difference in the Columbus hypothetical is that they would all be treated the same. There would be some type of hypothetically, 9 districts drawn, but you would run for the district in which you reside.
That is correct.
So you would be limited based upon geography to your neighborhood
That is correct.
for purposes of running.
Yes.
And then there would be a primary if more than 3 people wanted
If
to
3
run
or
for
more
that.
individuals filed to run, there would be an elimination primary. The top 2 vote getters, as well as anyone who qualified as a write-in candidate, would appear on the general election ballot.
And so the first time you would go to that structure, all seats, 9 in this hypothetical, would be elected at that point.
That is
Some
correct.
would just serve 4-year terms and some would serve 2 potentially as an option. And that would be determined based upon the percentages of no, I'm using the right
The
terms.
winning vote.
The winning
Yes.
vote, yes.
Yeah, the way that it's typically been done at the municipal level in changing to any new system is to do it that way. There are other ways you could do it. They raise, I think concerns or questions. You could, for example, say that in the first year, you identify 5 districts, and if you run in that district, you serve for 4 years, and then you identify 4, and if you run in that district, you serve for 2. I'm not sure that that's exactly a fair way to.
How do you determine which ones are which?
Exactly. How do you determine which district gets the 4 and which gets the 2? By doing it that way, you're really kind of leaving it up to voters to make that decision for you.
If that was the recommendation, we kind of talked the last time about the timeline and why 2019 is the date we were using just to even change the number from 7 to 9. You mentioned 2019 and then 2021?
That's correct.
Can you explain why that would be? I think I understand, but.
So as we've looked at other cities that changed their form of governance, there are 3 that have done it recently: Austin, Seattle, and Detroit. Austin is the outlier in that it grew its council by 4 members and adopted a hybrid system. The other 2 cities simply changed their structure. You would tend to see that you either change your structure or you add members in a given election, rather than changing all of that at once. I think the second question would be, depending on the outcome, were this the recommendation and were this approved by council for the ballot and approved by Columbus voters, ideally would be a fairly public process to develop those maps. I personally question whether that could be done in time for the 2019 election. I am not personally convinced that that's possible.
Yes, Carrie.
So the map drawing, so tell me when remind me when the current election cycle for council members, can you give me a little refresher on how that lines up with this 2019-21?
So 2019 is the year that the mayor would be on the ballot, as well as 4 members of council. This year is a year that 3 members of council, the city attorney, and the city auditor are on the ballot.
Okay, so I just have to repeat so my head catches this. So we have 3 members of council that will be elected this November, 2017. Then in 2019, 4 members of council would be elected. And arguably that's when there would potentially be a charter amendment that would propose to change the number of council seats from 7 to 9. And then you would have another charter amendment, or it would all be the same, just with effective dates?
Yes, I think that it would be accomplished by having effective dates written into a single charter amendment, rather than having a series of charter amendments. I think to the committee's previous point, staff is under the understanding that there is a reluctance to increase the size of council without some additional changes as well. In light of that, we presented this and are presenting it with a presumption that this would be a package for Columbus voters.
John?
Madam Chair, just to say it for the 45th time, this notion we had of this informal division of the city into service areas, I'm sort of now attracted to Jeanette's nomenclature, and council taking on a special relationship, one with respect to these service areas. That is a flavor, that is a version of what got explained here in a more formal way, and it would allow a test drive. And let's face it, between now and 2020, or maybe even 2 more years out, I mean, that's a long incubation period. And I sense if there's a hunger for change, there's a hunger for change long before that. And so I urge again this notion of the informal division of the city into service areas, this special undertaking between particular members of council and a service area, as a more immediate response that lets people sort of get a sense for how this might work. And because those service areas are informal, and it doesn't involve who you vote for or where you can run, you can suspend all that Section 2 concern about litigation This is just council organizing themselves in an effective way to improve effectiveness. So I'm still a champion of that notion.
Are you saying that in addition to, meaning that that's something council can do tomorrow, in essence, that doesn't require charter amendments, but still supportive or not supportive of a potential recommendation for a charter amendment to a
I
structure?
think I'm supportive of both.
That's what
Yeah.
I want to clarify.
This is a way of doing something quicker that is a nice step in that direction. And frankly, it gives people a chance to try it on for size. Maybe they won't like it. So let's make that an informed vote when it finally gets to the ballot.
Other thoughts, concerns? Carrie?
Oh, I've just been noodling that one over. I don't think this one takes, this, I like your creativeness with this, but it certainly doesn't take care of representative fairness, representational fairness, because you're still going to have a citywide vote for a district. I've got to think about it some more, but I think a 70-30 city, you're still going to elect all of them from the 70.
Madam Chair? I understand Fred Mills' comment, and he's right. Nevertheless, I do like the increase in what I call accountability. Because now we got a geography paired with a particular member on council, and that's not our case now. And so if I'm in a service area and my service area rep doesn't do a good job, now I'm out to punish somebody now. And I think that increases the accountability. And I agree with Fred, but I still think it's a huge step in the right direction.
Okay, this, maybe my question doesn't make any sense, but what structure would change that issue, Fred? So a true district ward elected by the residents?
With ward districts, or districts, however you define it.
Fine districts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With
That-
only those people electing them.
Yeah.
Okay, this goes probably to my ignorance about how the city population feels politically. Maybe I should know, but I don't. So that's still dependent upon what the district looks like, right? I mean, I'm just struggling with, in a city that's 70-30, I mean, isn't it going to be challenging one where, I'm just struggling, I'm not articulating my question well, but I'm just struggling with how, even if you had a ward where you're only elected by residents of that ward, aren't we a city that's going to, in a pretty significant portion, elect one party over the other?
Yes, but I think there's
Yeah.
a better chance that you'll elect someone from the minority party if you draw, let's say, 6 districts in Columbus, north, south, east, west, northwest. Specifically, if there's a northwest district, I think there's a better chance that you would elect somebody who's identified on the ballot as nonpartisan but votes Republican.
For example, if you had a state, let's say, for example, that was generally 50-50, and you were able to draw 12 congressional districts for one party and 4 congressional districts for another party, I think that's,
I already
I
said
think
I
that's
was.
an illustration of how it would be done.
I hear that. I'm still struggling in a city that's more than 50-50. Like, I get the issue when
Right.
it's close. I'm struggling a lot with this idea that, because I think I'm stuck with the idea of coming back to what's the real issue, what's a solution to the real issue, and I'm not sure even if you draw the districts in a sense, I'm not sure that actually addresses some people's issue of there being one party that's typically in control. I'm just having a hard time seeing that. I understand. I'm just having a hard time seeing
I
that.
agree that it would almost be impossible for the minority party to take control. But it would be much more possible and likely to elect at least one person from that party in a district plan.
I follow you. Okay. Jeanette?
And also, I mean, I know it trends Democratic in elections, but we still have a very large independent population in the city of Columbus. So, we shouldn't automatically go with the two-party. We should consider the swing vote, and that would impact, I think, where the districts are drawn. But the reality is, I mean, Brian knows probably more than I do, but, depending on the elections, that group will swing more than one way than the other, but we do have a big independent streak here.
And I think I mentioned this, for me, where this came from a little bit was, I absolutely support strengthening the area commissions, and I think that is critical. But there's still volunteers. There's still doesn't address the accountability of council members, which is why I still felt like there has to be something a little bit more to tie a council member to more geography. Because I think some parts of the city don't have, I mean, there aren't members of council that have been from those parts of the city for at least as long as I can remember. And I think that creates a significant challenge in and of itself, because whether true or not, the perception is there's no one who knows what we are going through, whatever the we are is and whatever we think we're going through. So something to me came back to, that there has to be something more, which is why I like this, hybrid district idea, I think that we were calling it, in the sense that I'm not comfortable saying I support a true ward or ward at-large system, especially in light of some of the votes that have taken place over time. I think Carrie, maybe you had mentioned that a couple times, that it seems hard to recommend that when there's just been an election in which that wasn't the side that was victorious, but it still seems like we should be doing more. I guess that's where I just struggle with as we went through these conversations. Jeanette?
And I'm just making maybe a devil's advocate comment here. I understand that people want to have that direct accountability, but I don't think it's fair to totally ignore the condition of the city, which is a very good place now, under the current structure of council. And with all the extra items added to the debate about voting for districts, if I can be tactful about those extra items, we still have to look at, maybe people like what they have, and the city has prospered. So, I know people just want to say, well, you're not doing your job, and you're not doing your job, and it's that council person. But overall, the structure has worked well. The city has prospered. And there are so many ways that we're here to recommend and to improve. To me, we're here to make things better. And looking at our city, I can't honestly say that we haven't made the effort to bring people into the process, that we haven't, as a city, put in place procedures to get that public input. And over the last 20 years, I mean, the neighborhood liaisons, the 311 system. We do have our commissions. There's the neighborhood pride. There's the civic and community engagement and council. My point is that we're not starting from zero. When we're not starting from a broken system, we're trying to improve a system. And my philosophy is do no harm. I mean, let's make sure that we build on what's good and that we don't break something that's not broken.
Yes.
Jeanette didn't mean to say not to give people the right to make that decision. I suspect she's right, that they're pretty pleased with the way it works now. But, I know you said that, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that the probably way it all works out. I think our responsibility is to offer up the next best idea and let people sort it out from there.
And I agree.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that
Yeah.
I don't think we're starting from a bad place. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm trying to say, that it doesn't appear that people feel that they have not had a voice. That was just my point, that we're trying to improve, that
Yes.
it hasn't been,
I would say just one thing I think that has struck me throughout this process, even though it's not the case now, under the current scenario, under the current structure, you could have a scenario in which all 7 council members come from the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
I mean, you could very well have that. It's not the case. I don't think it's probably ever been the case, but that struck me as something to think about in terms of reform. And even though, again, that is not the scenario, the testimony that we heard, I think there is, obviously being a Columbus resident and feeling great about the trajectory that we've been on, I also am understanding that there is a real strain out there of wanting to have greater kind of community representation. So I like this proposal. I think that one of my objections to award system is that, and I've made this point before, which is that you do potentially create the environment of increased acrimony on council because you are pitting one council member, one neighborhood versus the other. The thing that I think has been great about the city of Columbus is that we have generally avoided that because of our current structure. So to me, I think that is something I'd desperately like to avoid, is creating those turf wars that a strict ward system would create, even a hybrid at-large district would create. I think the second thing that is compelling, again, is if you want to make sure that you're having contested elections and that those elections are relatively competitive, if you look at this data, again, thank you, Brian, for reinserting this in here and re-clarifying that, the data is compelling in terms of health of democracy. So those two things, to me, make this a really appealing option. And then, the idea that you are, designating specifically a council member to be representative of a specific geographic area, I like, because I think it captures what we've heard throughout this process, which is there is a concern, legitimate or not. Is it a majority opinion or a minority opinion? I don't know, but there's a concern out there that there are some areas of the community that either don't feel they're represented, or when they do try to get representation, there's a lack of clarity about who their advocate is on council. So I think this is something I'd like to see us pursue a little further. I think the other thing that I like about it is, and I mentioned this before, and the line drawing process can be pretty contentious. It's made more contentious when it is strictly a district system. In other words, if the geographic voting block, is who will elect a certain member, if that's the sole determinant, it increases the intensity level of that line drawing process. In this scenario, though, the way I see this playing out in my mind is, while it's important because it will designate who's representative of that community, it has the potential for less hostility through that process, because ultimately it's the city at large that's going to make that determination. So, just thinking this sort of out loud as I'm talking here, there's a lot of things I like about this process. I think the one thing that I want to make sure we think through, though, is if we were to go down this path, how we would implement it. I think that could be tricky. So I'm very intrigued by this. I've been interested in this concept, and I'm glad that we're thinking it through, because I think there's a lot of promise to it.
Brian, on the Columbus plan, for each candidate running for the district, so we could conceivably have primaries if more than one candidate wants to represent. So if one district had more than one candidate, we'd have to have a primary.
Correct.
So not all districts might have primaries, though.
That is correct.
Yeah.
But it'd still be a citywide election.
That is correct.
So the person running for the far north side district, everybody in the city of Columbus votes for one of those candidates?
That is correct.
And, wow, I'm just thinking, we would almost have so if you had 5 people running, we'd have to have a runoff primary?
Elimination primary, that's
Yeah,
correct.
that's what I mean. Even if it's just one district's. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Chair Coe and members of the committee, I think that the question here is, should these districts choose voters or should they choose candidates? And I think traditionally, as you said, districts choose voters who then choose candidates who live in that district. And over time, depending on the way that those districts are drawn, that can tend to bring out less than politically representative candidates, we'll say. People who deviate pretty far from the mainstream of a given city or state. What I personally like about this plan is that the pool of candidates is limited to that given district. The pool of candidates will, of necessity, reflect the flavor of that district. But you have the moderating influence of every voter in the city having a voice both in the primary and in the general. I do believe that it is quite possible to elect an independent or a minority party candidate under the structure simply because by-place elections are more competitive. So I would, and I say that as a very proud Democrat. So I do think that one of the merits of this plan is that it avoids some of both the political and the policy implications of a ward system while injecting accountability at the neighborhood level into our system of governance.
I think one of the things, too, that struck me, I think, John, you said this about at this time when we were having that discussion, and that the Charter Review Commission in 2022 could look at the issue again. And I guess I was sort of thinking about the fact that even if we make a recommendation, it's still dependent on whether council agrees to put it on the ballot or not. So there's another step there. But even assuming council took our recommendations, the voters still vote. And so I think in that conversation you talked about, I believe it was Bill Schuck's proposal, that I just sort of thought, what stuck in my head was, has there been a good plan, or I don't want to say that the other plans were bad, but has there been a plan that the community could look at and the content was as thought out as it needed to be? I'm not sure I'm saying that well. So I feel like if this is a recommendation and it's thought out the way we proposed that it would be, and council were to put it on the ballot, with the structure and the support of how this would be done that would need to be there, then the citizens still vote. And at the end of that vote, they can vote no, and we have the structure we have today. And if I'm understanding it, we would have 7 council members and the same structure we have today, because this would be one amendment. So I think that was one of the things that I really was just reflecting on, that our recommendation isn't the end, but even council deciding to put it on the ballot isn't the final voice. But maybe this would answer the question that seems to only have been partially answered, is what do the citizens really think? Because I still struggle with, and when I talk to people, people seem interested and like a district idea, but not sure that what they've seen before is what they like. I probably put myself in that same category. And so I think this gives us the chance to put before the voters something that would actually be a little more clear that that's what, and I have to apologize, I don't know what the proposals looked like in the years before when this was put to voters. I'm only familiar with the most recent one. But I was struck by that, thinking about, do we punt too much? Does the next Charter Review Commission say, well, if we only had a structure to look at, and then does it keep going versus actually putting together what could be a legitimate proposal and having it out there for the voters to vote on?
Madam Chair.
Please.
When we had that conversation and we were having so much angst, we hadn't sort of identified this place a little bit in the middle that seems a little more sound in concept. And so the notion of asking people to do the same thing a year after they just said no, that was troublesome for a lot of us. And now we've emerged something that maybe merits consideration, serious consideration, before we wait for the 2022 train to be in the station. So we've had the same angst, and maybe both feel the same relief if, in fact, as we study this further, we become even more supportive of it being worthy of consideration, and we'll take the answers of the voters about, no, we like it just the way it is, or no, maybe we like this one better. So.
And I think, when you said it doesn't stop here, going back to the vote, and, we can propose this, council may approve it. The ultimate choice will be, what will the people think? And it's an expensive choice, because when we ask them, it's about $1 million each time. So we're also weighing, does this proposal merit taking to the people to spend $1 million? But it's one of those things we will never know. We will never know.
I would just add that it's only $1 million if it's at a special
Yeah.
election. If it's at a regular election, it maybe cost a few bucks more, but not much.
Okay, I take that.
Could-
But I'm
could-
just saying, yeah, you're right. Okay, I was thinking of a special election. So if it's not a special election, it won't cost as much. My whole point being, we will never know
Yeah.
until the vote of the people. That was my point.
And
That,
well taken.
that is so important that we will have to spend maybe $1 million to ask that question. That was my only point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I had just two quick additional questions. One, has there ever been a time when there hasn't been a primary for city council?
Yeah,
Quite
No
frequently.
primaries at all because it only, okay.
Yeah.
Quite
So this
frequently.
would almost ensure that there would always be some kind of a citywide vote.
That is correct.
Okay, so there would be an incremental cost
Yes.
with that. Okay. And this is a totally unrelated, but you probably see where I'm going. What is the residency requirement in the city of Columbus? 30 days, or a year, or, I think it's probably 30 days, isn't it?
Currently, it's a year living in the city in order to run for council.
I can see a lot of people moving. And currently, that would be a year. You'd have to think ahead. Okay.
Embedded in that was the conclusion that the residency requirement for service on council would be the same with respect to where you lived.
Right, yeah.
It may or may not be
May
the
not
same.
be, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Chair, if I may, I mean, I think if we go down this path, this may be premature, but if we go down this path, I think, and I mentioned this, that we do need to be very cognizant about how it affects the current council. I think that having gone through the line drawing process at the legislature, contemplating incumbency really, whether it's intentional or not, affects the line drawing process in a pretty significant way. So if we were going to do this, I would suggest that we do something to sort of grandfather in the current members so that when the lines are redrawn, that can't be a part or factored in. Where they live cannot be factored in any way, because I think that will skew the line drawing process significantly. And what I would like us to think about is, if we set this up, I would like us to think about not applying the residency requirement for the incumbents, but only allowing that residency requirement to kick in when there's a turnover in that seat. Because again, the disruption that it could cause, number one, and two, how, whether it's intentional or not, the district drawing process would be affected in a way that would undermine what we're trying to do because of consideration for incumbency. And I think we just take that off the table by transitioning something like this in.
I'm going to hope that the advice from staff would be that that's something council would have to sort out versus us recommending that too clearly. Because I don't want to try to figure out how that works at the moment.
Yes, and I think that naturally, because the drafting of the amendment and the
Yeah.
ordinance to put language on the ballot,
Yeah.
council will have to think through the
Yeah.
minutia and the technical aspects of this. And I think
I have
they'll,
100 questions about what he just said and how that would practically work when.
Yeah, we're kind of going back.
I don't understand. I get the concept and I agree conceptually, but practically I'm struggling with how that would work. But so we wouldn't. Your advice would be that we don't get into those specifics, other than maybe comments about taking that into consideration.
I think that if you have 7 council members that are sitting council members and the line drawing process takes place, it's hard to imagine that where they live wouldn't be in the back of the line drawer's mind. And if that happens, the idea of geographically representational districts would be undermined.
I understand what you're saying. I do. But even just kind of conceptually trying to figure out how you solve that exactly seems interesting to me.
Yeah.
At some point, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but at some point, how long will that incumbent council member get to, be bothered in.
And somehow you're negatively, what I'm getting at is you're negatively impacting another district, because if the way it's drawn, 3 council members live in the same place, then 2 other districts don't get a council member for their district until one of the 2 of them leave, and how do we determine?
I mean, they're 4-year elections, so I don't think, if you went a term, it's hard for me to imagine that the turnover wouldn't be such that it would pretty quickly resolve itself.
That's what I was gonna say. I mean,
Right.
that's why I don't think we have to sort that out, because I would think
Right.
if you put this before council now and put it on a ballot in 2019 and put it in place in 2021, there's a pretty good chance that between now and 2021,
Right.
a significant portion of council changes, that you're
Right.
already giving sort of notice that something like this is gonna happen.
Right, but I don't think a transition in is.
I don't
that
disagree
would-
with
I mean,
that.
I don't think that's too unreasonable.
Just the timing, but again, I don't think we have to resolve that, I hope not. We're gonna need a lot more meetings. If that's the case, Jeanette.
Brian, which city, where you were from, who uses this plan?
So we looked at Tucson, Sparks, Nevada.
Just like our Columbus plan, is it?
No, there are some variations. So for example, Tucson uses a partisan election for their primary system,
Okay.
and then you appear on the ballot with the partisan designation. In Washington State, I don't know if they apply partisanship. I don't know the answer there. And then in Nevada, both Sparks and Reno have nonpartisan elections like we do. The other variation in Tucson that you don't see, as I read the Washington State examples, is that in Tucson, that partisan primary is ward voters only. That has led to litigation that is currently pending, I believe, before the Supreme Court. Some courts have ruled that that's a violation of one person, one vote. Other courts have said that it isn't. It's questionable how the Supreme Court would come down on that particular kink in the way that you could do this.
And you had mentioned changing the structure or adding members, and I'm just thinking maybe it's either or to balance some of this out, because if you try to do both, you could have, I'm just looking at, what, a primary of existing council members, and, we have to think it through. It's possible, and I think it's fair to look at the existing incumbents, but I can see a traffic jam.
Something that got said here earlier, and I liked it, I'm comfortable with it, and I want to be crystalline in trying to hand it to staff. I've always had this discomfort about the fact we've just had an election, and suddenly the headline says we recommend a change. This whole notion that we know there's an appetite to do, maybe among some, to do it differently. For those who want to consider doing it differently, we believe this is something worthy of consideration. It's far short of saying, what we're doing now doesn't work and here's our better idea. That is not what's going on as a result of this dialogue we're having. This is one, we hope, maybe, is worthy of consideration. And I think that's as far as we go. I don't know. And we don't have any words like that currently. And so I urge on you words like that, because it creates more comfort on my part about exactly what's going on here.
I think, just to echo that, I think Jeanette made the point too, that we're coming from a place of a very successful overall city and what has happened. And so we're definitely not making any recommendations from my perspective on it hasn't worked and therefore, or it's wrong and therefore. So I do think the choice of words ultimately and why we're recommending it will be critical to those of you drafting. So since it's almost 4, and I said we were going to get out of here at 4, I think that this is my thought, that we schedule the next meeting. There was some draft language that I believe has been handed out in hard copy based upon the changes that were discussed at the last meeting. So some of our recommendations about improving area commissions and those kinds of things, I would assume we're probably still going down the same path. So I don't think we necessarily are talking about changing that. I think this has to do a lot with the structure of council. And I think ultimately how council is structured will have an impact on how people are appointed, since they'll have to come from those same districts and those kinds of things. So we may need to look at that appointment and vacancy language if there's things that need tweaked in there. But my thought process would be to ask staff to flesh out the Columbus plan option in more detail, as if it were a recommendation, with some of the positive language associated with it. And hopefully, as I said, I think our next meeting will be at least 2 weeks from now, so that would give us some time for staff to send that out, everyone to review it, and then maybe, would we come back together, fine tune at that point? Any suggestions, disagreements?
Only this one thing. I think it's way premature to call this the Columbus Plan. And I think that sends a signal that's contrary to the really productive dialogue we had just a minute and a half ago. It goes too far, too fast. It's a worthy alternate.
I only use the word in relation to what it says on the handout to flesh out. Let's go with that.
That's the Clark Johnson plan.
Okay. The plan on page whatever of the materials, go with that one.
Also, by way of word choice, you once used the words "district at large." That is a more helpful choice of words than this hybrid thing. We got all sorts of hybrids around here. District at large is helpful in creating understanding.
Could we just then call it, can you guys flesh out district at large language? And maybe how that would impact the other language we've already looked at. Okay, so before we leave, do we want to try to pick a date?
It's up to you, Chair. We would probably need a minimum of 10 days in between now and the next meeting for public notice purposes.
I'll be out of the state. So we're going to go with sometime after February 8th.
With the note that you did recently amend the bylaws
Yes.
to allow for electronic attendance.
But I'm going to propose at least some of us be here. So
I think I disappeared
I was going to say, that's what
17th, something like that. So that's a preferred window, at least for two of us.
And Fred, any schedule issues other than you'll be calling in or something with us?
That I should be open.
Carrie, thoughts on days of the week?
Yeah, I'm gonna be traveling in the middle of the week of the 13th.
Okay.
I could probably do the 17th, that Friday, but I'm gonna be out, I think, on Tuesday and Wednesday, maybe Thursday of that week. That's really the main conflict.
Does it work better for people to do it during the day or in the evenings? I'm actually not asking you guys, sorry. Any
Day for
opinion?
me.
Day?
I prefer to do it
Is
in the
day or
day.
night
It
easier?
it depends. I can do either.
Is the 9th an option for you?
You say
The 9th, yeah, Thursday? Just try not to put it out too long, because we probably will want another
What are we
meeting.
talking about on Thursday? One
What would be options for you?
afternoon?
What's, I don't know, is it all a problem?
Yeah, that Thursday.
Okay, how about the 9th, or the 10th, I'm sorry? On Friday? Like 2:30 on Friday the 10th?
No, for
Not
me.
good. Okay, that doesn't work.
The
Let me-
9th is better than the 10th.
The 9th is wide open for me.
How
What
about
about you?
1 o'clock on the 9th, so we have a little more time? Is that better?
Oh, is it all time?
1 o'clock on the 9th.
It could work if you can get in that window.
Okay.
On the 9th?
Yeah.
1 o'clock on the 9th, Jeanette, or Carrie?
Works.
One o'clock,
Yes.
all righty.
17th also on it. Are
Yeah.
those two both
I
in
was gonna say,
contention
so
still?
let's go with 1 o'clock on the 9th to start. And then if we need a second meeting, how does the 17th look for everyone?
Yeah.
That doesn't work for me, but.
Nothing on the 17th?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, the 17th, sorry, I thought I said the 15th. Yeah, let me check one. I think that.
Friday before the holiday weekend.
I like to pick Fridays before the holiday weekend, that's,
Please don't do that.
but we're gonna say 1 and end at 3.
I'm just,
Carrie, are you okay with the 17th?
What time?
1?
Yeah, I think I can make one work.
So how about 1 PM on the 17th? is our next, so the two meetings that we're scheduling is 1 PM on Friday, or I'm sorry, on Thursday the 9th, and 1 PM on Friday the 17th. If we're really efficient on the 9th, we won't need the 17th, but we should plan for it. Everyone good with that? And then we've caught only one person having to call in, otherwise we'll have two.
The staff is here in the mornings if morning meetings work as well for the committee.
Subtle.
Sorry, no. At least not for those two dates, we all agreed. Will one of you make sure of notifying the people who aren't here, maybe giving them a call? 'Cause I don't know if Pastor Laws gets as much email. Any other questions, comments, or concerns for today? Do we have a motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I always want someone to object. The meeting's adjourned.